Presentation of Leadership. Now each week I'm going to do a video like this, and it's going to walk through, talk through, explain through the PowerPoint presentation that you have online in the course room. So once you've looked at that, then you can come back and watch this as well. So if at all possible, try to open up this video and the PowerPoint so that you can kind of scroll through the PowerPoint while you're watching this, because I'm going to be talking through it myself, and so if you have it available on the side, you can sort of follow along with me. All right? So without any further ado, what does it do anyhow? And how come we don't want any more of it? Well, anyhow, this week we will have an introduction to leadership studies. Basically what I'm going to do is give you a broad introduction to the field, and then I'm going to narrow it down into one specific area of the leadership studies field, which is trait theory. Okay, so get ready for a general introduction plus a look at trait theory. Now, you probably noticed the beginning of the PowerPoint, there was a picture of some old guy with a funny hairdo and birds flying around him, and, you know, on the cover of a Christian history magazine. Did anybody know who that was? Anybody? Anybody? Did St. Francis? Did you say St. Francis? Yes, you're correct. This is St. Francis of Assisi. Now, why do I have pictures of St. Francis on the beginning of a lecture on leadership? Well, let me tell you why. Francis was born into a very, very rich family. At a certain point of his life, and I'm giving you this short version here, at a certain point of his life, he turned away from all that. He gave everything back to his dad. He walked away. And he went out into the forest, and he saw this old crumpled chapel there, and he thought to himself, yeah, this will give me something to do. And as he began to build it, he thought God was telling him, you know, build my church, Francis, build my church. Okay, I'll do that. And so he's putting the bricks back on, bricks back on. And as he was doing this, he really began to think, you know, I don't think this is what God is calling me to when he says build my church. I think he means more. I think he means reestablish the true nature of Christianity. And at that point, the church had become so rich and opulent, and the Pope had these big funny hats and robes, you know. And here was poor little Francis just kind of living a simple life committed to poverty and chastity and good deeds. That's what he wanted to do. And as he did it, guess what? People saw this. And they said, can we do this? Can we help? And they began to band together, and he began to attract all these followers. And, you know, it just went on, and before you know it, it became this big old order of the Catholic Church, which is still around today, called the Franciscans. Now, you might be saying, well, what does that have to do with leadership? Well, to me, Francis demonstrates the essence of good leadership. He was in touch with his own passions, his own sense of calling, and he did it not for the pay, not for the notoriety. He just did it because he thought it was the right thing to do, and other people saw that. And so leaders, you know, need to be driven from that point of passion and commitment and calling. And as you do that, guess what? Other people will see your commitment, and they'll want to join you. They'll want to follow your vision because it's genuine, it's authentic. See, leadership isn't about a title, it's not about an office, it's not about a salary, but it's about doing what you feel is the right thing. And if other people agree with you, you will attract followers, and you will be perceived as a leader. So I just start off the class by saying there's a good starting ground point zero for us to start our study. All right, so the first thing I want to do is look at the various approaches to studying leadership. And the first approach is the popular, I want to put these in pairs of dichotomies. And the first dichotomy is the popular versus academic. All right, so what is popular? Well, you know, if you've been into a bookstore in the business section, the management section, you've seen tons of business books. In fact, if you look at your bookshelf, you probably have a few of them there, right? And so this idea of popular leadership books for the general, you know, the general audience, the general market. You see them at airports, you know, you see them in magazines, and they're written by people that we know and love, right? By Rudy Giuliani and John Maxwell, and just these sort of people who become gurus, so to speak, about leadership. Written for a general audience, and they usually have great stories, right? But there's no theoretical basis, there's no empirical support. It's based on one guy's ideas or one girl's ideas about what leadership is. And so that model worked for them, and they're saying, this is how I did it. And so we look at that and say, you know, maybe I can learn something, maybe I can do it that way too. Now, the opposite or the other approach there is the academic approach. And these are books, these are ideas that are written by people who are trying to come up with theories, with grounded theories and with empirical support. Okay, so it's not just maybe if you do this it'll work. It's if you do this, this is the result you should expect. And so some examples are the leadership grid by Blake and Mouton, Sashkin's leadership belief inventory, the whole transformational leadership model that we'll look at in this class. These are really examples of more of an empirical approach to studying leadership. Okay, so there is some theory, there's some cause and effect that we assume to happen, and it's been tested and it's been tried, and so there's evidence that these ideas do have this cause and effect relationship. In this particular class, we're going to look at that one. Okay, you can go to the bookstores and the second dichotomy that we can look at in studying leadership is the Christian versus secular. Okay, Christian, based on a study of Scripture. The primary focus is on the character of the leader, spiritual development, morals, ethics, integrity, all those sorts of things. And again, you know, if you've been a Christian any amount of time, you've probably read some good books like this. Oswald Chambers, there's a lot of them. Bill Hybels, I mean, there's a lot of good Christian leadership books out there. Primarily designed to help you develop as an individual, as opposed to secular books. And these are based on principles of social sciences, and there's many foci, including the leader, the follower, and the context. And we'll talk about that later when we get into our study. And leadership and organizational effectiveness is the chief aim, not just, you know, your personal development, but really how can you meet the aims of your organization. So we'll look at, you know, both of those in this class, really. Well, the North House is a good example. Obviously, it's based on social sciences. But we're also going to balance it, too, with the Manns and Neck books as well, right? Based on scriptural principles. And again, as Christians, we can't discount that. That's a primary source for us for learning and understanding about life and about leadership. Some great examples of leaders, both the good and the bad. And it's a good source for us. So we shouldn't discount that. All right, let's talk about the romance of leadership. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean romance, flowers, candles, perfume, boxes of chocolates? Oh, I love you, leadership, my little baby, baby. No. It's nothing like that. It has to do with this idea that as a culture, we have a love affair with leadership. We love leadership. And I talked about all the popular books. You know, why is that? Why do people write books, and why do people buy the books? You know, the seminars and the, you know, videotape, everything, you know. There's just this general sense that in our culture, we really value and appreciate and love leadership. We like to learn about it. We admire leaders. We read their biographies. I mean, it's just a pretty pervasive thing. Let's think about why that is for a second. Leaders often become the favored explanations for various events in and around an organization. If the organization is successful, they assume it's because of a good leader. If the organization's a failure, we assume it's because it's a bad leader, right? That's called the halo effect. We're infatuated with images of great leader figures from the past all the way back to Scripture, you know, Alexander the Great, Middle Ages, kings, contemporary presidents, you know, politicians, popes, you name it. We love looking at the lives of leaders. They're such rich, you know, interesting lives. The persona and characteristics of leaders. You know, looking at the American dream, we kind of see leadership as, you know, a way to achieve success in our society. And because our society is kind of success-oriented, and because we have this belief that we can become greater. You know, it's not like India where it's a caste system. You're born here, you stay there. You're born there, you stay there. America, everybody is given the opportunity to achieve, and we really believe that. And we believe by studying leadership, it could help us to achieve and become better. And so I take you through here an analysis of the various topics of leadership books. This is interesting to see how all this worked. You know, this output is categorized into different areas. And so I'm not going to say a whole lot more about this because I want you guys to wrestle with this in one of our dialogue threads. Okay, so you tell me why you think we're so enamored with leadership and what this says about us as a culture. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about defining leadership. And if you see on the PowerPoint, it says write down a brief one-sentence definition of leadership. And that might be a good exercise. Just take a minute right now, pause, hit pause, write down your definition of leadership. All right, now if this was a class, I'd have everybody share their definitions, and you know what? We have the online threaded discussion. Maybe share your discussion, your topic in there, your definition in there. I've listed definitions of leadership that go back, almost 100 years. And I'm not going to read through them all. What I want you guys to do is I want you to read through them, and I want you to see if you can see an evolution of the definition of leadership. What did we used to think leadership was, and how do we see it today? And what worldview and assumptions does that indicate? Is there this shift that we see in the understanding of leadership? What does that say about our thinking about society and about human relationships? It's very interesting, leadership has changed, and the way we perceive it has changed. Now, I'm not going to tell you my thoughts on it. I want you guys to really wrestle with that in this class and through that dialogue question. Just like the romance of leadership one, I want you guys to wrestle with why you think leadership has changed, the evolving definitions, okay? Now, conceptualizing leadership. Some definitions view leadership as the focus of group processes, a personality perspective, an actor behavior, the power relationship between leader and followers, an instrument of goal achievement, a skills perspective. Okay, so all of these are different ways that we can get at leadership because it is a complex phenomenon and it happens in so many different ways at so many different levels. All of these can be true. Of course it's about groups. Of course it's about individual personality. Of course it's about acts and behavior. So what we're going to see as we kind of go through this course that all of these things sort of feed into what we understand about leadership. Some of the things we do believe is that it's a process, that it involves influence, that it occurs within a group context, right? If there's no people around you, then you're not really leading. So look over your shoulder, and if there's nobody behind you, guess what? You're just taking a walk, okay? You're not a leader. There's got to be people involved in order for leadership to be taking place. And of course, it involves goal attainment, right? Goals are being accomplished. And so we like to think that leaders are not above followers, although some of them think they are, that they're not better than their followers, but it's an interactive relationship with their followers. Okay, leadership is always about a relationship between a person and a group of people or individual peoples. And so if you go on, you see here a nice chart that's got 3 circles, right? Leader, follower, and situation. And where these three things come together, you have a leadership activity taking place. Now, by the way, let me just mention this too. I'm going to use the term leadership a lot, much more prevalently than the term leader, because leader to me connotes a static, unchanging kind of a quality. Leadership is a dynamic process, and somebody who's in a position, officially called a leader might not be demonstrating leadership, and vice versa. Somebody who's not in an official position called a leader might be demonstrating leadership. So leadership is that quality that we possess, that we enact, that when leadership happens. So it's not a static quality. So I prefer to refer to leadership and not a leader per se. Okay, another thing I say here is that leadership is both rational and emotional. And for those of you that are more rational, say, well, of course it is. We have to convince people of the logic and the rightness of our ideas. Of course it all makes sense. But that doesn't always work. And why is that? That's because people are also emotional beings as well. And so understanding how to lead people means understanding this emotional dimension, this emotional component that people have. And there's an interesting thing we know from physiology, from the brain science, is that our decision-making process, for better or for worse, is intimately connected with our emotional centers. And people who've had damage in their brains to the emotional process are also incapable of making decisions. What does that mean? That means that, quite frankly, most people are moved to act based on an emotional appeal rather than logic. Now, I think advertisers have known that for a long time, that you got to touch somebody's heart in order to get them to act. Now, does that mean we're manipulative? We try and manipulate their feelings? Of course not. But as a leader, somebody exercising leadership, you need to be aware of that you can't always just appeal to logic and facts and those sorts of things. You have to connect with where people are, how they feel about a particular situation. If you can get at that, then you can get their little minds open to understanding all the facts and those sorts of things. But understanding that it is both rational and emotional. It happens at different levels. We lead ourselves, our spiritual, mental, emotional growth, etc. But it's also about leading other individuals. This is what we call a dyad, right? You and somebody else. Groups and teams is another level of thinking about leadership. An organizational level. And this is a bunch of groups and teams and individuals working together. And then linking together with other organizations. So we have one organization in the ecology of or the field of their particular branch, whatever they do. So if it's a business, if it's a tech firm, you've got other tech firms. If it's a school, you've got other schools. And so we know organization operates in an island, especially in today's interconnected global world. We're all deeply interconnected. So leadership happens at all those different levels, and it really requires a different skill set. And I would say, that as we grow as leaders in our leadership ability, as we grow and our opportunities grow and our experience grows, then we're more able to sort of move up in those different levels of leadership. Now, a big distinction has been made between leadership and management. All right, so let's talk about the difference between these two. Management activities produce order and consistency, while leadership activities produces change and movement. Okay, so management is about planning and budgeting, organizing and staffing, controlling and problem solving, while leadership is about establishing direction, aligning people, and motivating and inspiring. Now you can kind of see right off the bat, those are two different skill sets, right? Very important. Now, is it possible to completely separate those and say, well, I'm just a leader, I'm just a manager? No, not really. A good leader needs to know how to manage, and a good manager needs to know how to lead. But conceptually, though, we can think about these things separately. And the reason why that's valuable is because in the past, historically, it's all kind of got lumped under, the management. And I think what's evolved in the last 15, 20 years is this distinction that no, leadership is different. It's not just about planning and budgeting, but it really is about establishing direction and motivating and aligning people. That's a completely different skill set, and it takes a different way of thinking about things. There's some more information there on the distinction between the two. And I kind of asked this question, is one more important than the other? Is one more valuable than the other? No. I just gave you the answer. Why? Because, if you just have a room with a bunch of visionary leaders, have all kinds of great ideas, but there's nobody there to implement those things or not the ability to implement those things, it doesn't matter. And conversely, if you have a bunch of great planners and people that, they can execute any kind of plan, but there's no vision, if they're not doing the right thing, it doesn't really matter. So Warren Bennis once said, he said, managers do things right and leaders do the right things. And so it's really a combination of both of those that lead to success in an organization. You have to do the right things and you have to do them right. All right? Right. And of course, there's some myths that hinder leadership development. Maybe you've heard these. Maybe you believe these. That good leadership is all common sense. Anybody can figure it out. Or that leaders are born, not made. Well, I heard one guy say, are leaders born or made? And the answer was, well, of course they were born. I don't know how they got here if they weren't born. Now, having said that, do some people have natural inborn characteristics that lend themselves to good leadership? Well, of course they do. But that does not mean that we cannot learn, that leaders do not have experiences that help them to develop as good leaders. And the other myth, the only school you learn leadership is from the school of hard knocks. You probably heard your grandpa say that one. So, myths to be sure, and we're going to smash a lot of them in this class because we're going to learn a lot of things that will help us become better as leaders. Okay, so the first major idea about leadership that we're going to talk about in this class in the first chapter or two, I think, of North House is the trait theory. And this is the idea that it's all about the leader. It's about personality characteristics. These were called great man theories because the focus was on identifying the innate characteristics of great leaders of history. So people like Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, people in Scripture, they just believed that these people had these innate characteristics they were born with, and that's what set them apart as great leaders. You know, this was the first way they thought about leadership, the great man theory. And so great leaders were these people that were they just had it, you know. And traits such as birth order, family, physical traits, age, height, all those things. And it was felt that leaders were born to lead and the genetics gave them greatness. And so if you go on, you see here in the slide that the height, intelligence, extroversion, all those sorts of things sort of lead to leadership. Now, is that to say that none of those things are untrue? You know, if we've completely got past this trait idea? Well, there are still some ideas of trait theory that help us to learn today. And the biggest one today is personality theory. And we know that there's certain personality characteristics that if one possesses, they will be perceived as an effective leader. So for example, intelligence. Okay, if somebody is articulate, if they're smart, if they can kind of grasp things conceptually, that is a good leadership characteristic. Self-confidence, right? Does anybody want to follow somebody who lacks self-confidence? Oh, I don't know where we should go, how we should do this. You know, nobody's going to follow you if you lack self-confidence. So that is a wonderful trait to have in order to be perceived as an effective leader. Determination, you know, the desire to get the job done. Persistence, initiative, dominance, drive, being proactive. And some people just have that more than others. Other people just kind of give up easily. Other people are like, no, you know, they'll die trying. And so that's a good leadership characteristic. Integrity, being honest, trustworthy, taking responsibilities, loyal. Everybody loves that. And I think as Christian leaders, these should be the things that are the hallmarks of our leadership, is that people know we're honest and trustworthy and have integrity. And then social ability, the inclination to seek out pleasant social relationships, people that are friendly and outgoing, courteous, tactful, diplomatic, good emotional intelligence. These people will be perceived as better leaders, right? People that are just real cut and dry, they don't care about people's feelings, you know, they don't get along well with other people. And so maybe they can achieve great things, but that's going to hinder their leadership. So, what can we say in summary here about all this stuff? Well, having a leader with the right set of traits ensures leadership effectiveness, and selecting the right leader increases organizational effectiveness. And so this is to say, you know, you can work on certain characteristics. You know, if your emotional intelligence isn't that high, you know, you need to work on that. You need to develop your sensitivity and ability to discern other people's feelings, to be sensitive to that. If you lack self-confidence, you need to deal with that. Why is it? You know, get the skills and develop, you know, experience and success. You know, so they say success is the best thing to develop your own sense of confidence. And once you have success doing something kind of baby steps, then you have more confidence going forward. And so you need to work on your confidence so that other people see that and perceive you as a leader. There's some strengths to this approach. It's intuitive. There's some research support. The weaknesses, well, there's no definitive list. Ignore situational factors, which we'll talk about next week. Subjective evaluations of most important traits, ignoring leadership outcomes, and it's not useful for training leaders, because the reason is because a lot of personality traits are very static qualities. In other words, our personalities are fairly well formed and hard to change, and so you can't, you know, it's hard to have a training on something like this where you can train. There are certain things you can train for. It's tougher to train, you know, for example, if you're not tall. Well, how are you going to train? Well, everybody wear elevator shoes. You'll be seen as taller and people will perceive you as a leader, right? Well, it worked for Saul in the Bible. By the way, did you notice that there's been study on effective CEOs, and on average, they're like 4 to 5 inches taller than everybody else. Why is that? Because we perceive taller people to be to have a leadership quality. And so it's just something, you know, Napoleon, the Napoleon will make it through every once in a while, but it's usually the tall guy. And maybe, I think this is some sort of deep primal seated thing, you know, that we as human beings have. If we look up to somebody, we perceive them as a leader. Maybe it's because, you know, our fathers or whatever were taller, and so we always looked up to them as a leader. So anyhow, you can't really train for that stuff other than the, you know, elevator shoe thing. So anyhow, that's about all I'm going to say about this topic this week. I hope this was helpful. Please go online. We got those 2 great discussion questions about the definition, the evolving definitions of leadership, and the other question about the romance of leadership. And I'll be in there, and I'll join you guys soon. So God bless you.